week. I also had a trade paperback pickup. Very rarely do I pick these up day and date, so I figured I'd just call it out here quick. But DC Inc. has a new book out by Claudia Gray, which is called House of L. This is book 2 in the series. I haven't actually read the first one yet, but I have it. So I'm excited to sit down and give both of these a read. If I like them, I'll give you guys a review and recommend them. But Claudia Gray, I'm familiar with from the Star Wars universe. She's written quite a few Star Wars books under the Disney umbrella. And almost across the board, she's the best writer they have on their payroll. You'll hear me talk about her when I do my Star Wars High Republic overview video, which is still coming. It just won't be till probably the end of January because I'm trying to reread the entire first year of stuff, which there's a lot of it. But yeah, I just thought this was interesting. Basically takes place on Krypton. Has actually pretty decent art for like a DC Inc. book. A lot of times I'll leaf through these and I'm just like, blech. But I've also had some good experiences with DC Inc. I read Primer last year, which was fantastic, and Claudia Gray is really good at writing kind of this level of fiction. If you've read Volume 1, let me know what your thoughts were on it down in the comments, and like I said, if it's any good, I'll revisit it. Now, of course, that's not the point of today's video. Today's video is all about what books came out for Batman this week. Week 2 is always a pretty heavy week for the Caped Crusader. In addition to the books that I got, there were a couple books I didn't pick up even. So we got the new issue of Pennyworth this week, and we got the, I think, last issue of Robin and Batman, the Jeff Lemire, Dustin Nguyen book. I might circle back and pick up all 3 of those in one fell swoop, just when I'm in the mood to read it, but I haven't been buying it day and date, even though I really like that creative team. The books I did pick up this week were Batgirls issue number 2, Batman Urban Legends issue number 11, Future State Gotham issue number 9, which I'm actually caught up on this series. At some point I'll talk about it when I do kind of a retrospective on the whole Future State event. Also probably sometime late January or early February at the rate I'm getting videos out here. But actually found myself enjoying this a lot more than I expected. I've really enjoyed the black and white art that's been in this. Joshua Williamson was writing it for the first 7 issues, and he did a really great job setting up Red Hood and how he fit into the Bat family, and him kind of having to go undercover behind enemy lines was really interesting. My one issue with it was there was kind of like a Mad Hatter nanotech plot going on in it, which read very similar to me as the Mad Hatter stuff going on in the animated series Continues books. But nevertheless, actually kind of a little gem of a book. So if you're not reading this, if you can go back and pick up some of the older issues, you might be surprised. All right, next up, the title I'm most excited to read this week, Detective Comics. This is part 2 of Shadows of the Bat. Can't wait to see what this new issue has to offer. We've got Harley Quinn, the animated series, issue number 5. I Am Batman, issue number 5. And then finally, Joker number 11, which I am wondering if this is the penultimate issue in this story arc. We've got to be getting close. I'm really curious to see how this issue measures up. Last month was kind of a dud because it was sort of a side tangent, hoping that we get back to the main story here, although I did notice we no longer seem to have Gilliam March on art, which is pretty disappointing. So we'll see how this issue plays out. So yeah, like I said, a lot of Batman books this week, quite a few continuity titles to review for you guys. So I'm going to get reading and let you guys know what happened this week in Batman. Alright, so I've had the opportunity to sit down and read through the continuity Batman books for the week. I've ordered these from least favorite to most favorite, and overall it was an okay week. It's one of those weeks where there was kind of no surprises. So like the books that I expected to be good, I enjoyed. The books that I expected to not care for, I didn't really care for. So as we're going through this list, you'll probably already know the order I'm going to go through these books, which is a little disappointing. Because, you know, even the book that was my favorite book of the week, It's a little less fun when your favorite book is exactly the one you expect it to be almost. Like, you want that book to kind of come out of left field and surprise and delight you. None of the books really did that for me this week. My number one book I enjoyed thoroughly, but even with it, it was kind of like what I expected and nothing really more. So that said, let's talk about what my bottom book of the week was. And I don't think anyone's going to be surprised. It's Batgirls number 2. I actually bought this book digitally late last night because I thought it might be interesting to see what this looked like if I read it that way. Because this book is clearly tailoring itself to a younger audience, an audience who isn't buying things physically. And so I thought, let's read it more in the way that it's intended to be read. Like, I don't think this is intended to be a physical book at all. And once I read it digitally, I feel even more strongly about that because of all the books that I read, this is the only one that doesn't even have any double page spreads. Like, it's very digestible if you read it digitally. Furthermore, the colors on this, which are really sloppy looking to me when I look at it physically, it's all very, it's colorful, but sort of muted almost, and it's just really the printing aspect of it. When you look at this book digitally, it really does change my opinion of at least the colors. I still don't like the art, but all of it works together in a much different way than it does physically. So yeah, I just thought it was an interesting thing worth noting. But that said, how was the book itself? Overall, kind of at the same level as the first one, to be honest. All in all, it feels very been there, done that, because, Batman is in a different place right now. Detective Comics also in a very different place right now. I really love the direction of those two books. It feels like classic Batman, like pre-New 52 Batman to me. Whereas this is still very much in that James Tynion era. And I think the further we get into the new direction Batman's going, the more irrelevant this book is going to feel. So they need to figure out a direction for this to go. If you picked up the first book and were disappointed by it, or you didn't care for it, this book isn't really going to sell you. Kind of on a similar note, I Am Batman number 5, also mired in James Tynion land. I will say it feels like there might be a new beginning here in issue number 6, because this book promises to be getting out of the Talos initiative that Lucius Fox seems to be caught up in, and they're going to be sending this new Batman to New York, and things are going to be starting fresh. What I would love for issue 6 to do is really invest in a consistent artist on this book and basically be like a soft reboot. Because this book has got literally 3 different artists on it, and it doesn't work. There's some cheeky sort of editorial acrobatics going into why there's a different artist on this, but you've got sort of this artist style for the majority of the book, and then about halfway through, Jace Fox is injured and he's like a little groggy, and then you switch into this other style of artwork that is basically colored completely differently, and they just don't do a good enough job selling you on the idea that because he's dazed, you would have this different art style, because the story continues from multiple perspectives, because you're not just following Batman in this, you're also following Lucius Fox, and all of the art changes during that period. So yeah, as I alluded to, the story in this sort of sets up a new status quo. He ends up in New York at the end of this, which the logic of which isn't really clear. He just kind of appears there at the end, which is a little bit weird. But you do get a little bit of a reconciliation between Jace Fox and Lucius Fox. Lucius Fox realizes Jace is this new Batman, and so he sort of has to make a choice between his crusade against vigilantism and protecting his son. I think there's a lot more drama to be mined from that. However, if we sort of sweep that problem under the rug so we can get to a new storyline, get out of the Talos, aka Magistrate 2.0 stuff, and get into something a little bit fresher, I'm actually pretty open to them moving beyond that story arc and getting into something new. It's really just going to depend on where John Ridley goes with issue number 6. All right, the middle of the road book this week for me was Batman Urban Legends number 11. Overall, probably the cover story was the one I enjoyed the least, I think. I really didn't connect to the artwork in this one, and I didn't connect with the story either. Now, I have no idea what's going on with Batman and Justice League right now. It seems to be somewhat tying into the goings-on there. But there is a pretty heavy implication that Bruce Wayne and Zatanna are romantically entangled, which is something I just don't buy. It's just an idea that doesn't sit right with me, especially now that we're in this sort of omniverse DC universe. Zatanna is someone who, like, really wronged Batman pre-Infinite Crisis when she basically used magic to brainwash him. So I just don't see Bruce Wayne ever really getting over that and then suddenly becoming romantically entangled with her. Plus the idea that he'd be like romantically entangled with someone who's like a magic user just doesn't feel right to me for some reason. It's just a little too out of his control. I can't picture him being willing to fall into a relationship like that. Now, if that is something that appeals to you, there is some good writing in here, if you buy into the premise to begin with. The panel layouts, kind of the awkward relationship that they're set up as having when they're in the Batwing together, I think overall works well. It's just the premise in and of itself that I just wasn't really sold on. The next story we got was White Witch in Stigma, part 1 of 3. And this one was kind of interesting. It's written by Ram V, and it's spinning out of Catwoman. So White Witch was a major player in the Catwoman book. She popped in I think, the very first Ram V issue. I saw that he is now off of Catwoman, which I'm really bummed about. We're going to have to see how Tini Howard can measure up. But if you liked Ram V on Catwoman, this book might be a pickup because this is sort of picking up some threads from that storyline. Largely, this looks like it's going to be a origin story for White Witch. The big revelation at the end of this is that at some point she crossed paths in her journey with Bruce Wayne and Ghostmaker when they were training to be superheroes back in the day. The story's got interesting artwork, and Ram V is always up to the task to giving you a good read. So if Ram V is someone you like, Ram V alert, he's in Batman Urban Legends this week. Third story in here is Eternity in Gotham. This one just didn't do much for me at all because I just don't know anything about Kid Eternity. The art in this I just didn't like at all. If it had better artwork, I might have been more interested. But again, it'll just kind of depend on where it goes. Ultimately, this is a murder mystery plot that's going to be set up and paid off in 3 issues. So you just kind of finish reading it and you're like, well, gee, I wonder who the bad guy's going to be. It just kind of reads like filler more than anything. But if you're an Eternity fan, this might be right up your alley. Let me know down in the comments. Now, the last story is called The Trap. And this was easily my favorite read of Batman Urban Legends 11 because this is all about Ace the Bat Hound. This is the Ace the Bat Hound that was unveiled in, I think it was Batman Rebirth Annual number 1? Don't quote me on that. There's been a lot of different Ace the Bat Hounds. This is the one that was rescued from Joker's lair. I'm pretty sure it was in Rebirth. They play him very much in this like the hounds in John Wick 3, which if you've seen John Wick 3, you know that's like one of the coolest parts of that movie. So that was a really welcome addition. There's one really weird moment in here where like Hugo Strange blows himself up, which was quite confusing because I'm pretty sure he's still kind of a major character in Harley Quinn, but I'm sure they'll find a way to explain that away further into this run. The whole point is to get Batman separated from the Bat Hound and have him submitted for reconditioning. So yeah, all in all, I thought the Ace the Bat Hound story was a pretty fun read, actually. It had my favorite art in the whole issue, and I always welcome an Ace the Bat Hound story, so I don't know, I'm just a sucker for that kind of thing. If you think that that's corny and you're not into it, maybe give this one a try because they give it a good spin. In the grand scheme of Bat Hound stories, this one is actually pretty grounded and interesting. Okay, so on to my second favorite DC book of the week. We've got Joker number 11. We've got Giuseppe Camuncoli on art now, and I am definitely missing Gilliam March. I just really would have liked this series to wrap up with a full run by Gilliam March and supporting background stories by Francisco Francavilla. That said, there is enough consistency in kind of the coloring on this book that even though Camuncoli and Gilliam March are very, very different artists, I actually found that there was a surprising amount of continuity between the two of them. That was something I was pretty worried about, and it was all right. It didn't take me out. As far as the story goes, it definitely feels like we're really ramping up towards a conclusion. Gordon has come back to Gotham City. He's been rescued by Barbara Gordon. He's injured. She's basically got him under lock and key. She's decided to commit to helping him finish this investigation herself. There's kind of an interesting parallel to the very first issue when we start chapter 17, and she goes to meet Jim Gordon's benefactor at this airport, very, very similar to the very first issue, which was kind of a cool parallel. But of course, James Gordon is not interested in letting Barbara Gordon do this by herself, and he escapes with the help of Harvey Bullock in order to see this investigation to its conclusion. People have been pretty 50-50 with this Joker series. I definitely think this is probably better read as a trade because it is a slow burn, but I think this is going to have a pretty explosive conclusion. Like, the whole premise of this has turned into it's the Joker versus the Texas Chainsaw Massacre family. And I think that that's going to be a really interesting place for this series to wrap up. Because I don't pay super close attention to previews, I have no idea how much longer this is running, if it's going to be canceled after this series ends, any of that kind of stuff. So I'm just month to month eating it up. But we're definitely in for some fireworks with issue number 12. If you haven't been reading it, go check out the first trade. It's available. I do recommend it as a read. It really is pretty good. Plus, every month you get that Punchline backup. And I always say I'm a sucker for Punchline. With chapter 11, we spend a lot more time with the Royal Flush Gang and like the patriarchy of it, which I didn't know anything about them. I've only known them as just, a group of bandits. But this story introduces a much stronger hierarchy to the Royal Flush Gang and how they're kind of trying to use Punchline as one of their pawns. And you really get the strong impression at the end of it that everything they're doing is gonna blow up in their face, but in Punchline and presumably Joker's favor. So even though we haven't gotten to the Punchline trial, there's some really interesting revelations in this that raise the stakes for when that trial begins. I'm really excited to see where this goes. In a perfect world, to me, we would wrap up the Joker with issue number 12, let this series take a breather, and then start an ongoing Punchline story, because I just want more and more of this story as I read it. They've done a good job so far of parsing out the little details, but I think it's time to invest a full 20 pages every month to let this story really ramp itself up. I'd really, really like to see DC do that. No surprise for pick of the week, I've been singing this book's praises for quite a while now. It's Detective Comics 1048, part 2 of the Shadows of the Bat arc, which tells the story of what happened to Arkham Tower once it was erected. This story continues to bounce around timelines. It begins many years ago, where you get to find out a little bit more about who Tobias Ware is and where he's coming from, what his motivations are in building this tower and trying to cure Gotham's most insane villains. Although, of course, the book makes it quite clear that there's something going on under the surface that we haven't quite figured out yet. We get to follow Batwoman, who comes in undercover as a potential employee of the tower, which is interesting because I'm pretty sure Batwoman is outside the tower when everything hits the fan. And her and Oracle are basically trying to get to know more about Tobias Ware and what it is he's really up to. Honestly, there's no huge revelations in this story. It's more just teases of what's to come. You get to go down into the basement of the tower and see what is going on with Gotham's villains, which is basically that they're just wandering around like normal people. You can see Mr. Freeze here with this new kind of outfit, which is kind of cool, which is of course juxtaposed with prior fights with Mr. Freeze. Great artwork on this page, by the way, by Ivan Reis. Fantastic art throughout, to be clear. We also get to spend a little bit more time with this Harley Quinn copycat, who I think is introduced for the first time in 1047, although she might have shown up in the annual or somewhere a little bit earlier than that. I think this character is going to be one to watch, because I think the idea of a copycat of Harley Quinn at this point is pretty interesting, because Harley has become such a strong character on her own, separate of the Joker. And then at the end, basically, Batwoman, Nightwing, and Oracle have the opportunity to compare notes in Gotham's underground. So, like I said, not a lot of huge revelations in this, more just some interesting character setup and some teases for what's to come. Now, of course, Detective Comics does have a backup story with the House of Wayne, which is called House of Wayne on the outside, but then House of Gotham on the inside. I don't know why DC is doing that. It's kind of confusing, but whatever. This backup story is also quite good. We've got art in this by Fernando Blanco, which for me is just dripping with personality. I really, really like Blanco's sort of noir art style. Plus, it's really interesting to see what happens to this kid that was orphaned by the Joker. Basically, Bruce Wayne steps in to make sure the child gets the care that they need. And we have a couple guest appearances from villains in this that are kind of interesting. So first up, the kid runs right into Clayface while he's at Arkham Asylum. And they have kind of an interesting moment together because they kind of bond, but then the guards rush in and separate them because, of course, Clayface is a danger. Made for kind of a poignant moment for both of the characters. And then also, we get to spend some time with Harleen Quinzel before she is Harley Quinn. And she's fascinated by this boy because the kid doesn't see any difference between Batman and the Joker, which is kind of an interesting philosophical question. All in all, a really promising backup story that I hope continues for several issues. If I'm recommending based on stories, not based on books, I'd recommend both Shadows of the Bat and House of Gotham from Detective Comics. I'd really strongly recommend Punchline. Both the Joker and Punchline kind of have the same problem where if you haven't been reading it up to this point, it's hard to really recommend it, but I really do like the Punchline stuff going on in here. And even though the mileage may vary, the Joker story is pretty good too. And then even though it's a little bit more off the beaten path, I do really recommend the Ace the Bat Hound story in Batman Urban Legends. Every single story in here is a part one, so if you're looking for a place to hop onto this, it might be worth it. It's kind of too bad that DC isn't collecting these Urban Legends stories in separate trades. I saw that the first Urban Legends story has all the different stories collected into one, as opposed to just having the Red Hood story in a trade and just having the Grifter story in a trade. It's one of those things where if you're interested in any one of those stories, but didn't want to buy it in singles because you didn't want to read the other stuff, they're not giving you the opportunity to do that in trade either. So that's kind of a bummer because Urban Legends has a lot of good stuff in it to offer. So with that, thanks for tuning in to find out what happened this week in Batman, and I hope you guys have a great week in comics. Thanks for watching.